My boyfriend of 7 years cheated on me. It all began with a conversation I never thought I'd have, with a truth I never thought I'd need to confront. 7 years into our relationship, my boyfriend came clean about his affair with a coworker. The depth of the revelation unraveled slowly, his words careful but laced with guilt, like he was peeling away a mask he'd been wearing, one thread at a time. He admitted that they'd slept together 4 times, the first instance in July, the final time in October. Each time had happened after work events, and no alcohol was involved. He didn't blame it on that. No, he was fully aware, fully in control, fully responsible. The signs had been there, faint but present, and looking back, I realized that maybe a part of me had just trusted too deeply. She was flirtatious from the start, dropping little hints and lingering gazes that I'd heard about in passing. I'd never thought much of it. When he told me he wasn't interested, I believed him. But as July approached, something shifted. Her attention grew more forward, her comments more daring, and instead of brushing them off, he began to playfully respond. It was a small change, but it was enough to set off a chain of decisions that would ultimately dismantle what we had. The first time, he told me, was at a party she hosted at her house. He was the last to leave. She kept asking him to stay, and he fully understood what it implied. And still, he stayed. He explained it in a detached way, almost clinical, as if recounting someone else's actions. She was available, and I was just in the mood, he'd said, as if that made the act less personal, less a betrayal. What hurt most was knowing that this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It wasn't a single mistake that he instantly regretted. 3 more times, the same situation replayed, and each time he chose to stay. Each time he knew what it meant for us, knew that he was slowly eroding the trust we'd built, yet he went ahead anyway. And somehow, during all this, he acted like nothing was wrong. His laughter, his touch, his familiar expressions all remained unchanged, and I had no reason to doubt him. When I asked him if his coworker knew he was in a relationship, he admitted that yes, she knew, but he never made our relationship seem significant. He would downplay it, brushing off any mention of it, and if she ever brought it up, he'd get annoyed, effectively silencing her. This, he confessed with a look of shame, was a deliberate choice. He didn't want to be questioned, he didn't want her to bring up the reality he was so keen on avoiding. He didn't want to be reminded of what he was risking every time he chose to stay. The last encounter was only a month ago. He claimed he'd ended things then, finally facing his coworker and telling her it was over. But she didn't take it well. She accused him of leading her on, of making her feel like something more than a fling, a mistress who'd been promised nothing and given even less. Her reaction was hysterical, he said. She felt used, humiliated, as if all she'd been was an outlet for his fleeting desires. It wasn't until that day, seeing her anger, her tears, that he fully understood the damage he'd caused, both to her and to me. That night, as he sat alone, the weight of his choices crushing him, he decided he had to tell me. He didn't want to continue carrying the guilt, he wanted to give me the freedom to decide if I wanted to stay with him. And so, late into the night, he called, his voice barely a whisper as he asked if he could come over. When he arrived, his face looked drained, a mix of dread and sadness. As he walked through my door, he wrapped me in a tight embrace, whispering that I might hate him after hearing what he had to say. For a split second, my mind went to all sorts of things, but cheating wasn't even on the list. That possibility seemed outlandish. I trusted him that much. Maybe he had gotten into trouble at work or with something else. Drugs even crossed my mind, but cheating? Not my boyfriend. Not the one who knew me like no one else, who was my best friend and confidant. I joked, whatever it is, it can't be that bad, still not fully taking him seriously. He looked down, his face crumpling, and when he glanced up, his eyes were brimming with tears. My heart sank. This wasn't a joke or a minor confession, this was something heavy. He took a shaky breath, his words barely audible, and told me he'd cheated. I froze, feeling like my world tilted slightly. For a second, I thought he was pulling some twisted prank, but the look in his eyes told me it was real. He looked broken and terrified, whispering apology after apology, each word wrapping around me like a heavy weight. And that was when it truly hit me. This was no joke. This was my reality. Slowly, he began to tell me everything, leaving no detail out. He explained how it had started, when it had happened, how he and his coworker had communicated only at work. No secret messages, no phone calls, it was all so secretive and calculated. I sat there, numb, listening as he revealed each moment of betrayal. My heart felt hollow with each word he said, as if something precious had been cracked open and left to spill out. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The same man who'd held my hand through every storm, who'd been my rock, had now become the person I'd never expected him to be. When I asked why he'd chosen to confess, his answer stung. It wasn't because he'd regretted it immediately after or because he'd suddenly had a change of heart. It was because the guilt had finally become unbearable. After 4 times, 4 deliberate choices to betray me, each time knowing the impact it would have on us. And now, because he couldn't handle the weight of his actions, he was unloading it on me, claiming that the least he could do was to give me the freedom to choose. It was messed up in a way I couldn't fully express. I couldn't believe that this same person, who'd always held my heart with such care, had gone out and recklessly shattered it. He admitted that he didn't like the person he'd become. His ego, he said, had been stroked by her attention. She'd bring him food, drop compliments, and he let it get to him, feeding into a side of him that he barely recognized. He called himself stupid, selfish, unable to understand how he could have let something so trivial ruin what we had. And even now, he told me that he would try to win me back, that he would still pursue me, but it would be up to me to decide if I wanted to stay. As he sat there in front of me, I saw glimpses of the person I loved, the person I'd spent the past 7 years with. Our transparency had always been something we'd both valued. He never hid his phone from me, never minded if I looked at his messages, and we'd always trusted each other enough to be honest about everything. We were young, still figuring life out, but we did it together. In our little world, we'd built a foundation that felt unbreakable. Friends and family would often admire our relationship, saying how perfect we seemed, how well we balanced each other out. We were polar opposites in many ways. He was spontaneous, I was a planner, but somehow we made it work. People looked at us and saw what I thought was real love. Our families were intertwined, his parents adored me, and my family saw him as part of our own. We were each other's first love, first relationship, first everything. No one would have guessed he could do this, not because he was flawless, but because he genuinely seemed devoted to me. He was the guy who had taught me how love should feel safe, supportive, real. And even when we argued, which we did often because of our different personalities, it never felt like it threatened the relationship. We'd argue, let things cool down, and come back stronger, like teammates who knew they were working toward the same goal. Fights never felt like the end, they felt like growth. I truly believed we were in this together, unbreakable. But now, sitting across from him, I couldn't help but question everything. Every look, every touch, every laugh we'd shared felt tainted by the weight of his betrayal. I wanted to scream, to cry, to ask him how he could do this to me, but all I could do was sit there, staring at the man I thought I knew, wondering if I'd ever truly known him at all. What happened was devastating, a heartbreak that seemed to sink deeper with each passing day. Strangely, I wasn't mad, not in the explosive way I might have expected if someone had told me this would happen. Instead, a quiet sorrow filled me, mixed with a confusion that kept swirling around one single question: where did things go wrong? It didn't make sense. We were doing well, at least, I thought we were. He hadn't changed in any obvious way during those months, and he'd continued to be his usual self, the same mix of infuriatingly playful and genuinely loving. The betrayal stung even more because he'd always been the one to make me feel safe, cherished, even protected. He wasn't the type to be manipulative. If anything, he was the opposite, always so open and willing to walk through things with me, no matter how minor the issue. When there was tension between us, he'd insist on talking it out, sitting me down and giving me his full attention until we'd worked through it. There was no game playing, no mind tricks, just two people who cared about each other enough to make sure nothing lingered unsaid. As I listened to his apologies, his pleas for forgiveness, I could see the regret in his eyes. He was asking me to take some time off from the relationship, to think it through and maybe find it in my heart to work things out with him. He said he was willing to wait, no matter how long it took. But all I could feel was the unbearable weight of our broken trust. Despite his apologies, I felt like a stranger to him, someone who'd been blindsided by the person she trusted most. The only answer I could give him was a heartbreaking "it's over." I couldn't see a way forward, not when the memory of his actions hung over us like a shadow we couldn't escape. Since then, every night, he'd send me a message. Sometimes it was a short apology, sometimes just a simple "I'm thinking of you," but he never missed a single evening. Some nights, I'd hear a gentle knock on my door, and there he'd be, just standing there, looking as lost as I felt. It was as if he couldn't quite let go, even though he knew he'd already lost me. I couldn't bring myself to ask him to stop coming by, either. A part of me was still bound to him, still grieving the future we'd planned together. His mother messaged me, too. She said he'd told her everything, admitted it all, and she wanted me to know how sorry she was, even though it wasn't her fault. She offered words of comfort, of understanding, but I could feel the weight of her own sadness woven into her message. She'd always treated me like family, and now, I knew she felt the loss just as deeply. In many ways, I felt like I was losing a part of her, too. My own family, though, remained in the dark. I didn't have the courage to tell them. The thought of seeing the disappointment in their faces, of hearing the inevitable questions about what went wrong, felt like too much to bear. I couldn't face the reality of having to recount the details, of watching their opinions of him and of us shudder. For now, it was easier to keep it inside, to process this quietly, even if it meant carrying the weight alone. Moving forward felt like trying to walk with shattered glass in my shoes. I wanted to be angry, to lash out, but all I could feel was this hollow sadness that wouldn't go away. I kept questioning myself, wondering if there was something I missed, some warning sign I'd overlooked. Or maybe there was something I could have done differently, something that might have kept this from happening. It was a cycle of self-blame and grief, and every time I thought I'd found some semblance of peace, another wave of pain would crash over me. I missed him, even now, and that was the hardest part. I missed the person I thought he was, the person I'd loved and trusted with every part of me. And even though I knew I couldn't take him back, a part of me still longed for the comfort he used to bring, for the warmth and safety that had always surrounded us. But that safety was gone now, replaced by a void that I didn't know how to fill. Days turned into weeks, and I kept trying to find a way forward, even if the path felt foggy and uncertain. A part of me just wanted to move on, to close this chapter and rebuild myself without him. But every now and then, I'd find myself lost in memories, revisiting the beautiful parts of what we'd shared. I couldn't help but wonder if those memories, those moments of laughter and love, meant that maybe, just maybe, it was worth another try. Maybe we could find a way back, somehow rebuild what had been broken. But then, the thought of giving him another chance was followed quickly by a bitter voice in my mind, reminding me that once a cheater, always a cheater. Could I really forgive him? And even if I did, could I ever trust him again? I'd always been a believer in second chances, but I wasn't sure if I could ever look at him the same way. How could I love him fully if my mind was constantly plagued by doubts and suspicions? Going through this made me see relationships and people in a different light. I'd always thought that if things were solid, if love and commitment were there, nothing could break it. But now, I realized how fragile trust could be, how easily something precious could crumble with one wrong choice. No matter how wonderful things seemed, there was always the possibility that something could go wrong. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that I couldn't build a future with him if trust had already been shattered. I knew what I had to do. To truly start healing, I had to let go of everything that tied me to him. I gathered up all the things he'd given me over the years, the little notes, the gifts, the keepsakes that once held so much meaning. He'd asked me to keep them, told me they were a part of our story. But to me, they were just reminders of something that no longer existed. I needed to return them, to let go of the weight they carried, to feel lighter somehow. It hurt, more than I thought it would, to pack up those pieces of our past. As I sealed the box, a part of me felt like I was closing off a piece of myself, too, the piece that had once felt safe and secure in his love. But I knew that holding on to these things would only keep me chained to something that was over. There was a sadness that lingered, a frustration with myself for even debating if I should give him another chance. I knew, deep down, that this was a deal breaker. But I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, not just by him, but by myself, for still wanting to see the best in him despite everything. It made me feel foolish, pathetic even, that I was caught between my love for him and the respect I knew I deserved. I loved him still, that much was true. But love, I realized, was not enough without trust, without respect. Those were the foundations of a healthy relationship, and if they were gone, then there was nothing left worth saving. I'd given him my heart, my loyalty, and he had let it slip through his fingers. The thought of forgiving him seemed impossible, and the idea of trusting him again seemed like a fantasy I could no longer afford to entertain. So, as I finally closed the box and prepared to return it to him, I knew this was the end. I could no longer hold on to the what-ifs and maybes that had haunted me since that night. It was time to let go, to move forward, and to start finding myself again, without him.